Millennial honoraria.
Exacto. Bueno, yo mando saludos a mi hijo que el domingo cumpleaños. ¿Cómo ves?
¿Quién?
15.
Ah, el Gordi. Wow.
Si estuviéramos en México, le digo, si estuviéramos en México te estaríamos haciendo un fiestón, ¿no? Pero aquí es súper, nada. Aquí no se festejan los 15 así.
Pásale la tarjeta, préstasela media hora.
Si quiere un Xbox One.
¿Y luego qué esperas?
Pues que sea su
¿Qué
día.
esperas? Que traes cuero. ¿No?
Que se porte bien.
Exacto.
Saludos a mi queridísimo Víctor Pequeño, que cumplas por lo menos unos 80 más, ¿no?
Ay, sí.
¿No? Bueno, está bien.
Muy bien.
Que te veas igual de bien que tu papá.
Ajá.
Porque
Porque tu mamá, ¿qué?
Porque sí, no, está difícil. Bueno, muy bien, saludos. Mi queridísimo Abraham Bausa, ¿a quién quieres mandar a saludar? Ah, perdón, disculpe usted. Usted puede seguir a mi querida Gaby Barrio Nuevo. Aquí tiene el Twitter en pantalla. Mire, ahí está. Regia de corazón, para que sus fans, que dice que ya tiene su grupo de fans.
Nada,
no, bueno,
yo
ellos
no he
dicen
dicho
la verdad.
nada.
Ya la Rockstar está empezando a tener rating por sus looks.
La vamos a tener que buscar en ClickView para ver cómo está el...
Eso, analizar, imagínate que diga así.
No, pues no.
No, bueno, ahí lo tienes.
Ahí, Ángel, para que busques Regia de Corazón.
Regia de Corazón. ¿Cuándo le vas a mandar a tu fan de Ferris Light TV?
Es que no me acuerdo cómo se llama. ¿Por qué me agarras
bueno.
así?
No, yo no te agarro nada, ya quisieras, fíjate.
No, fíjate que no.
Bueno, muy bien.
Y esperamos que se haya comprado el otro fan, el microcell, para que...
Exacto, a Pimponaz, que se haya comprado
Que se lo haya comprado para que
el
tenga
microcell para que
le compre unos tacos.
¡Ey!
Nada más que no sean de trompo, porque me hacen daño.
Bueno, sácaselos de tofu. Bueno, muy bien, mi querido Abraham Bausa, ¿a quién quieres mandar saludar hoy? A Venezuela, chico, que no.
Aparte de Venezuela, que bueno, está en lo último y está bien feo todo eso ya. Mi abuela que acaba de cumplir 90 años.
Uy,
bueno,
qué padre.
Qué barbaridad. Saludos a la abuelita de Abraham. Saludos.
Muchos
y bueno,
saludos.
pues usted me puede seguir en Juan Tech TV, aquí le dejo mi Twitter en pantalla. Síganos, coméntenos, bienvenidos a La Gente Vive Canal. Gracias por transmitir Tecnocasters, gracias por transmitir los breves de tecnología Tecnocasters, a Ferris Live TV, a iTunes, a las plataformas que nos siguen. Muchísimas gracias. Y a usted, que gracias a su audiencia y gracias a su preferencia, hace que es el mejor podcast de tecnología en español. Nos escuchamos y nos vemos la próxima semana.
Bye.
Bye.
Hasta luego.
Unplugged in, Perseverance hits its mark.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the signs of past life.
The six-wheeled rover lands on Mars with high expectations.
Perseverance is also carrying a small helicopter called Ingenuity underneath, and that will be the first time, if it works, that we'll have powered flight on another planet.
And America's place in space is being challenged with a global competition for travel and exploration.
Competition from our perspective is always good.
Unlocking some of the mysteries of the red planet, Unplugged in, exploring Mars and beyond. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. After speeding hundreds of millions of miles through space over 7 months, America's space agency, NASA, successfully landed a six-wheeled rover on the surface of Mars. One of the goals of the mission? To determine if life existed there. It's the first leg in a U.S.-European effort to bring surface samples from Mars to Earth in the next 10 years.
Last week, after 7 months hurtling through space, NASA's six-wheeled Perseverance rover landed on Mars. The U.S. Space Agency released this video showing the first high-quality images of the spacecraft landing on the red planet. Its navigation cameras captured this 360-degree view of the landing site. Scientists also equipped Perseverance with 2 microphones. One of them was activated for landing and failed, but NASA managed to capture this audio of Martian wind just after touchdown. Dave Gruhl is a team lead at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He says this latest finding can help sustain the rover and its mission on Mars.
The noise is an incredible thing that engineers can use to basically detect the health of moving systems. If we get a snapshot of a actuator today, and you can compare over time, do another snapshot, another audio file of that actuator in the future, compare the two, and see if there's anything that can be learned in terms of the health of that device.
NASA aimed to park its rover at the Jezero crater that scientists believe was once filled with water, an essential prerequisite for life as we know it. Perseverance is the biggest vehicle NASA has to rove on Mars. On board is the helicopter Ingenuity. Together, they will survey the Martian surface and collect samples that could answer an age-old question: did life ever exist beyond Earth? But that's not all, according to NASA's Thomas Zurbuchen.
What's so exciting about this, it's not only the landing and the investigations, which is the search for extinct ancient life from a time where life arose on Earth. If everything goes exactly like we hope, late in the 20s, we're going to go pick up the samples this vehicle is collecting and bringing it back to Earth for the first round trip to the planet Mars.
Perseverance is scheduled to spend at least 1 Martian year or 2 Earth years exploring the landing site region of the ancient river delta in a lake that once filled the Jezero crater. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
It is an amazing feat of engineering to get the rover and a helicopter to Mars intact. And then there is more amazing engineering to get everything to work properly and send back those mystical sounds and pictures. One of the people making it all work is Matt Smith, a systems engineer on the Mars 2020 mission at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I asked him about his role in the mission.
During our cruise to Mars, the 7 months we went to Mars, I was one of the flight directors. So we had a team of about 8 people who were responsible for flying the spacecraft, kind of a combination of pilot and air traffic controller and sort of team coach. I say, imagine Ed Harris in Apollo 13, but less drama.
Do you actually control the speed and the direction, or is it pre-programmed by the Perseverance?
We actually do have to do what we call the trajectory correction maneuvers over the course of cruise to enable us to hit our target for entry, descent, and landing. So we did 3 trajectory correction maneuvers on this mission, and we also do other activities like we turn the vehicle to make sure that we can maintain communication. We also do a lot of checkouts of all the backup subsystems. There's no like AAA on Mars, so we bring backups of everything. We have to check all that out. And we also check out the instruments. So actually cruise is a pretty busy time. And then before launch, I was on the team that tested and designed the rover and got it ready.
Okay, took off in July, landed in February. You only did 3 corrections in that time?
Yeah, that's right. We had an opportunity to do up to 6 if we needed them, but we have a navigation team that's constantly tracking where we are, and they help us determine whether or not we need to do those maneuvers. So it turned out we only needed to do 3 of them this time around.
What did you expect? Is that like average, or 3 is what you sort of expected, or is that unusual?
The prior mission that we're based on, the Mars Curiosity, it did 4 trajectory correction maneuvers. So 3 is one better than we expected. We expected we'd probably do 4.
Perseverance, when it took off from July until the time it landed, was it being watched 24/7 by humans?
Yeah, so at the very beginning, we did have 24/7 what we call coverage. So there's a network of antennas called the Deep Space Network that's managed by NASA, and there's antennas in California, Spain, and Australia. And the idea is that as the Earth rotates, you always can see any spot in the solar system with these antennas. So at the beginning of the mission, the first couple weeks, we did have 24/7 coverage. And then in the middle of the mission, in the middle of cruise, we had around 8 hours a day where we could talk to the spacecraft. And then near the very end, for the last month of cruise, we had 24/7 coverage, so that if anything came up, we had an ability to talk to the spacecraft and get it ready for landing.
All right, so you've outlined very careful, controlled Perseverance and what you can do to correct and everything. But the last 11 minutes before it landed, you had no ability to control it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, at landing, Perseverance was, I think, over 126 million miles away from Earth. So the time it takes radio signals traveling at the speed of light to get from Perseverance to Earth is, as you say, 11 minutes. So we really didn't have any ability to, in real time, joystick that landing, and the spacecraft had to do it all entirely on its own.
So it must have been a tough 11 minutes. When you realized that you were at that point, that 11 minutes, you thought, okay, well, we can't do anything and we don't know what's happening.
Yeah, well, and the way it works is as we approach landing, we're getting data from the vehicle the whole time. So, we know that it's approaching Mars, and we can see from the data that it's entering the atmosphere. And so we actually can see it going through all the steps of landing. It's just that information is 11 minutes old by the time it reaches us. So it's already happened by the time we receive the signal back that landing was good.
Okay, its first job, Perseverance, is to get some samples, get some rocks, get some cores. That's its first job?
Yeah, so it's going to do a few things. It's going to, as you say, collect samples, and this is kind of the first leg of a round trip from Mars back to Earth. Also, Perseverance has a couple other what we call technology demonstrations to kind of lead the way for other missions. So one of those is an experiment called MOXIE, which will actually generate oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. It's mostly carbon dioxide. And that's to pave the way for potential human exploration of Mars. Obviously, we need oxygen to breathe, and also it can be used for rocket fuel. And Perseverance is also carrying a small helicopter called Ingenuity underneath, and that will be the first time, if it works, that we'll have powered flight on another planet, which could maybe pave the way for larger flying vehicles in the future to do more exploration.
Well, one of the goals of the mission is to find out if life ever existed on Mars. Will you be able to tell that from the pictures it sends back, or do you have to wait for it collecting its samples and we send some other vehicle up to get those samples whenever that happens? Or can you tell that from the pictures that can be sent back or information you get?
My sense talking to the scientists is that we'll have a good indication from the payload and the pictures and the spectra that we get there. But there's this saying that exceptional claims require exceptional proof, and really to get absolutely definitive proof of ancient microbial life, say for example an image of a microbe or something, we likely would have to return the samples to Earth and use really large and sophisticated equipment that we could never fit on a rover to do that final confirmation. So I think really because finding life on Mars would be such an incredible thing and such an important discovery, you really want to be super sure, and that would require bringing the samples back to Earth and analyzing them here.
All right, the rovers we've already sent up at Perseverance, they stay. So something's got to go and get the samples that have been collected. We've never done that before, sent something to pick up samples and come back. When is that likely to happen? How far are we from developing the technology, or do we already have it? That seems like a more difficult task to me, just to land something, collect something, and also be able to leave.
Yeah, you're totally right. It is a huge challenge. Good news is the technology demonstrations are already, the technology development is already in work at NASA and our partners at the European Space Agency. And the idea is that we would send a mission in the kind of latter half of the 2020s that would land another rover on Mars and a small rocket. That rover would go then and fetch the samples, bring them to the rocket that's on the surface of Mars, blast them into Mars orbit, and then we would have a third spacecraft that would go grab those samples from Mars orbit and bring them back to Earth. So a lot of moving pieces, but we're already starting on those.
But that's going to be 8 or 9 years from now, right? That we collect them?
That's right, yep.
Now let me turn to Ingenuity, the helicopter that's been sent up. And what is first the difficulty or the uncertainty about whether or not it'll fly? That's the first thing. And secondly, why did you want to send a helicopter? If we've got the rover, it can take pictures, it can gather things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that makes flying a helicopter on Mars so difficult is that the atmosphere of Mars is extremely thin compared to Earth. So it's only about 1% of the density of Earth. And we've tested a helicopter on Earth in a vacuum chamber that has been pumped down to simulate the environment of Mars, and it worked pretty well. But there's a lot of unknowns, like how will wind affect the helicopter. To make it fly on Mars, the rotors have to spin extremely fast. It also has to be very light. So this is a really big challenge to fly on Mars. And one of the reasons we're doing this is I sort of think of it as analogous to a mission NASA sent in 1997. They landed a mission called Pathfinder, and there was a small rover called Sojourner on it. It was about the size of a microwave. And it was the first rover on another planet. And now we have a big SUV-sized rover that's roving Mars. So if we think about the helicopters maybe analogous to that, hopefully in the future we could have much larger helicopters exploring, and that would let us cover a lot more area a lot more quickly. The rover itself only travels at like a little less than walking speed, if you can believe it. So we can get a lot of places, but it's relatively slow, and a flying vehicle would let us explore so much more quickly.
Do you expect to find some evidence of life on Mars? I mean, what's your sort of expert opinion and hypothesis?
So my own personal opinion is that the scientists tell me that we know that this location that we're sitting, Jezero Crater, was an ancient lake bed. We know that there was water there, and this was billions of years ago, around the same time that microbial life was getting a foothold on Earth. So we really are in the best position possible, almost on the entire planet, to find ancient microbial life if it existed.
How do you know there was water there? I mean, it looks like to me, and I see the pictures. It looks like a desert to me. But I mean, how do you know there was water there?
That's actually a big question from the scientific community. We knew Mars was a lot warmer and wetter. Mars doesn't have the same magnetic field that Earth does. So there's some hypotheses about interaction with solar wind, but I think that is still one of the big questions: is what happened to the Martian, the water on Mars? Perhaps it's frozen under the surface. Perhaps it got lost into space over billions of years. That's something that planetary scientists are still trying to unwrap.
Is NASA preparing for human exploration? We've sent these rovers, but what about humans?
Yeah, Mars is definitely on the roadmap for NASA's human exploration program. So the Artemis project is NASA's current effort to return the next man and the first woman to the moon, and eventually that would lay the groundwork for sending humans to Mars. Later in this century, and it's definitely the long-term goal of NASA human exploration to put humans on Mars.
What are you most excited to learn about with this, with Perseverance, with its mission?
Well, I think some of the questions we've talked about, like, was Mars habitable? Is there evidence of ancient microbial life? I mean, to me, that's incredible science. That's the type of thing that, rewrites our textbooks and would really change our understanding of where we fit in the universe and maybe where life could exist elsewhere on other planets or around other stars. So to me, that's really exciting. I'm also just, as an engineer, super excited to see the Ingenuity helicopter take off. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So a lot of really cool things going on with this mission.
What's your wish list? What would you like to do beyond this in terms of space exploration?
Well, one of my sort of pet interests is a field called exoplanets. So exoplanets are planets that orbit stars other than our sun. And 25 or 30 years ago, this was we didn't know of any exoplanets. It was sort of a pie in the sky dream. But a few missions recently have shown us that essentially almost every star in the universe has at least one planet around us. And we're just developing the technologies now to be able to detect those planets, image them. It's a really hard problem because it's like looking for a firefly next to a lighthouse in terms of the brightness of the planet and the brightness of the star. But I mean, imagine if you found a sun-like star and were able to detect an Earth-like planet around it. That could really, increase our chances of finding a habitable location besides our Earth elsewhere in the galaxy.
Well, it's so exciting, and I appreciate you talking to me today.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
SpaceX, the company founded by Elon Musk, is planning to launch the first space flight with an all-civilian crew. The spacecraft will orbit the Earth for several days, sometime in the fall. It will be a 4-person crew led by an American billionaire and pilot, Jared Isaacman, who is paying SpaceX an undisclosed sum of money for the flight. Also selected for the flight, a young woman who beat the odds against bone cancer. When it lifts off, she will become the youngest American in space. Plugged In's Elizabeth Chernoff has her story.
So I'm going to space.
Haley Arsenault is 29, a cancer survivor, and now she could become the youngest American person ever to fly into space.
As one for all. Getting this call to go to space came out of completely nowhere. And but I think that's the beauty of life, is sometimes it surprises you.
The opportunity has come her way through her workplace. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. It was where she was treated as a child battling bone cancer.
So when I was 10 years old, I was working my way towards my black belt. And I had actually just gotten my black belt in Taekwondo before I was diagnosed with cancer. But I started having knee pain. And they thought it was from overuse from the Taekwondo. But then I started limping. And my mom noticed a big knot above my left knee. And she took me to the doctor who did an x-ray. And I'll never forget, she came in the room with me and my parents and just said, "This is bone cancer."
My disease is called osteosarcoma, and it's a bone cancer. It's very serious. If you don't catch it fast, it spreads.
I spent a year at St. Jude undergoing intense chemo and then also surgery to save my leg. And as difficult as that year was physically, it was the most meaningful year of my life.
Arsenault now works at St. Jude as a physician assistant. She was chosen by the hospital and billionaire philanthropist Jared Isaacman to fly on the private Inspiration 4 SpaceX mission later in 2021.
3, 2, 1, 0.
It will be the first space flight without an astronaut aboard, but before liftoff, there's training to be done.
It'll start with the centrifuge training, like going around really fast to feel all the G-forces. And then we're just going to prepare for any possible situation. We're going to spend a lot of time in the Dragon simulator. And then I'll get some additional preparation as I'm the medical officer of this flight.
Unlike the NASA and SpaceX flights that go to the International Space Station, this one will travel around Earth for several days, during which time Arsenault said she expects to participate in science experiments and also make time to video call kids at the hospital.
I really hope to inspire these kids by going on this mission to dream big, that they can do anything. I was talking to this little girl yesterday and she was saying that she's upset that she can't run or jump. And I said, I can't run or jump either because I have a prosthesis in my leg. But I said, that's not stopping me from going to space. And so, this mission is opening space travel up to anyone. And I think that in itself is going to motivate people and give them so much hope. Kids are so visual, and I hope that them being able to see me in space really shows them what their future can look like. I'm the first St. Jude patient to go to space, the first pediatric cancer survivor, but I know I'm not going to be the last.
The United States is not alone with a mission to the Red Planet. United Arab Emirates and China have missions to Mars. The UAE says space has opened a broad range of possibilities for everyone in the Arab world.
The Martian surface has never been so popular for Earthling vessels. In July 2020, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and China launched missions to the Red Planet. At the time, Earth and Mars had the type of ideal alignment that only happens every 26 months. Sarah Al-Amiri is chair of the UAE Space Agency. She says the years-long journey to build and launch a craft could inspire other Arab nations.
Today you have households of every single age group passionate about space, understanding a lot of science that happens in there. It's opened a broad realm for possibilities for everyone within the UAE and also, and I truly hope, within the Arab world.
The UAE's orbiter fired its main engines for 27 minutes to enter the Martian atmosphere in what's being called the Hope Maneuver. It took another 17 minutes for nervous scientists on Earth to learn the good news. The following footage comes from Chinese state television, and VOA cannot independently verify its content. It claims to show scientists at the moment China's Tianwen-1 probe entered orbit around Mars. The Chinese craft executed a similar slowdown technique to the UAE's Hope Maneuver. Tianwen-1 will stay in a so-called parking orbit to survey the surface, looking for potential landing sites in May or June. Arash Arbasadi, VOA News.
The competition for natural resources is making space the next frontier to mine for minerals needed for the next generation of batteries, electronics, and military equipment. Jim Green is chief scientist at NASA. Among his achievements is leading the 2012 mission landing the rover Curiosity on Mars. I asked him about the benefits of space exploration programs.
Well, what's happening in many ways is humans are leaving low Earth orbit. Our plans are then to trek to the moon, learn to live and work on a planetary surface, and then investigate Mars into the future. Mars is a pretty spectacular place. I mean, it is a planet that we can actually live and work on like none other. So we're interested from a scientific point of view. Its history. How did it come together? You know, what is it made of? Are there resources there? Can and how would we live there? And it tells us a lot about the potential for maybe a place where life could have started, when life started here on Earth. We've got to learn to live and work on a planetary surface. We want to be able to tease out the resources that are on the moon. We believe there's actually a significant amount of water in frozen form, trapped in permanently shadowed craters in the south and north pole of the moon, which is why we're going to the South Pole. Once we learn how to extract that and begin to use that, because we can breathe the oxygen that comes from water, we can, of course, drink the water. We also can create rocket fuel. That's actually some of the first things that we want to do when we go to Mars.
And have any of the discoveries been of benefit here on Earth? Any of the discoveries from the space station or any of our exploration?
Oh, there's been an enormous number of discoveries that have occurred on space station that we're using here on Earth. We're learning that in space without gravity, certain types of things like crystals can grow. We also learn that changes in the body that are not related to the gravity then can be really looked at more carefully. And therefore, we've seen a variety of medical advances that have occurred from space station astronauts.
All right, we had a space race with the Soviet Union, which led to the man on the moon. We got there first. Are we in a space race, for instance, now with China? I mean, is there competition? And good competition. I don't necessarily mean, a bad competition.
Right. Yeah. Competition from our perspective is always good. We're excited to see what the Chinese are doing. You know, they have plans also to land on the moon. They have several rovers there now. We're turning our attention to do that. They've started to build a space station. That's exciting. So they're discovering some of the major scientific activities that we have been working in for several decades. So this kind of work is very healthy between these nations.
And what are other nations doing?
Some nations are getting into this concept of getting more commercial companies going. I know the Japanese are, and a couple are starting up in Europe too. So it's a model, I think, that's going to leave the U.S. and go into many of these other countries to be followed.
And is NASA now working with private companies? Is that something a little bit different?
It is different, and it's really a very important part of the whole plan. And the concept is, of course, getting more companies having the ability to get into space, because we have the space station. SpaceX and Blue Origin and a number of others can allow transportation back and forth that enables us to turn our attention to these grander plans about going to the moon.
Are the private companies and NASA working well together, or is there some stepping on feet and duplication of what the private enterprise is doing and what NASA is doing?
What you're looking at on your screen.
Well, the private companies together form a competitive network, as we always like to have. You know, we always are looking for the best price for the best product. So that's going on. But from our perspective, it's a really healthy environment because we have a number of companies and groups to work with.
What are you most interested in seeing in this, in Perseverance? I mean, what's the one sort of thing, like, you want to see if it can do?
Well, what it will be doing that we really want is it will be coring rock. And in fact, here's an example of one of the cores. It looks like a piece of chalkboard chalk or Crayola creme, depending on what era you're born in. We don't use chalkboards anymore these days. But we want to core rock in certain places where there's sediments in these deltas, where life may have really come down these rivers and then deposited and created the rock that we see today. And then we want to bring those sediments back. Just like the Apollo rocks, we want to be able to interrogate these in our laboratory and really tease out the history of Mars through the rock record.
Well, Perseverance got a core and gather those rocks. Does it deposit someplace, and how do we get those rocks back to Earth?
The plan is that we will go to a location and create several cores. We put those cores in a metal sleeve, all right? And then that is sealed, and then we lay that on the surface and then move on to other areas. So we will be leaving these samples on the surface for later pickup.
And what's later pickup?
Well, we're planning those missions right now. That's the next thing.
Are we alone in this universe?
So my answer to that is, this is why we're going to Mars and why we're looking out beyond our solar system for planets that are more Earth-like to determine if we are alone or not.
All right, so we have the moon, we have Mars. Looking beyond that, what do you see NASA doing?
Well, Moon and Mars is going to be enough for, in terms of human exploration, for sure, for the next several hundred years. But, you know, NASA's doing a lot in many other ways. We have missions that are currently at Jupiter. We have one that's way out in the outer part of the solar system. The Voyagers are still working, and we've gone into the Kuiper Belt with New Horizons. So we have quite a spectacular program all over the solar system.
Jim, thank you for talking to me, and thank you for your work. I got to tell you, I'm a big fan of NASA. It's very inspirational. It's very exciting, and I would have loved to have been part of the space program in some way. I chose the wrong career.
Well, there's always room for you, Greta. Come on. You can come help us anytime you'd like. Thank you so much for inviting me.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guests, NASA Chief Scientist Jim Green, Matt Smith, Systems Engineer for the Mars rover Perseverance. Keep up with the latest news at voanews.com, and do follow me on Twitter @Greta. And we leave you with more of the amazing images from Mars. Thank you for being plugged in.
COVID-19 transformed the way we do business. Now more than ever, fast lead generation and customer retention will determine if a business survives or not. The Now Media Video Business Card is designed to be sent using your smartphone. It's the next generation business card that will open the door for you while keeping social distancing. The Now Media Video Business Card is affordable for anyone from startups to multinational companies and is already being used by hundreds of businesses. Stay open, stay in business. Call us today.
Unplugged in, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, imprisoned and unsure of his fate.
We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both.
After surviving a poisoning, the Putin critic is pushed further into Russia's prison system.
We imposed Russia sanctions on Alexei Navalny's poisoning and detention.
Beyond new sanctions, how might the new American president change the U.S. relationship with Moscow? Unplugged in, U.S.-Russia, sanctions and policy. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. Alexei Navalny says he's being held about 100 kilometers from Moscow in what he calls a real concentration camp. Russia's opposition leader was jailed in January after returning to Russia after an attempt to kill him by poison. Navalny was sentenced to prison for parole violations dating back a few years. Navalny's lawyer confirms his client was recently transferred to Penal Colony No. 2 in Russia's Vladimir region. Navalny's jailing sparked protests across Russia and generated demands from around the world for his release. In response to the jailing, the United States imposed new economic sanctions.
It's clear that Russian officials targeted Mr. Navalny for his activism and his efforts to reveal uncomfortable truths about Russian officials' corruption and to give voice to Russian citizens' legitimate grievances with their government and its policies. We are exercising our authorities to send a clear signal that Russia's use of chemical weapons and human rights abuses have severe consequences.
With its new leader now in prison, Russia's opposition movement faces an uncertain future with parliamentary elections. Those elections are scheduled for September. VOA's Charles Maines tells us more from Moscow.
Vladimir Oblast, less than 100 kilometers from Moscow. The prison Alexei Navalny will call home for at least the next 2.5 years is said to be among Russia's most oppressive and brutal. And it's just one of many ways the government continues to apply pressure on the opposition figure and those seeking political change. Opposition candidates and municipal deputies gathered recently in Moscow to discuss strategies for competing in the country's fall elections, asking how to beat the odds and win local races against a Kremlin-backed political machine. They never got their answer. Police broke up the proceedings, arguing the event had ties to a foreign NGO the state deemed undesirable in 2017. With the entire conference placed under arrest, those who were there described it as an exercise in the absurd.
The events in our country of late are such that the writer Franz Kafka could only envy. He couldn't possibly have had enough imagination to make this up.
Fear has become the Kremlin's primary tactic as it tries to keep government opponents off the ballot and clearly off the streets. Thousands were detained during protests that followed Navalny's detention, with many kept in grim conditions and family members in the dark.
I couldn't get any information at all. You call and they tell you nothing. And now, only at midnight, did I find out he was at the prison here.
While others subsequently faced a more Soviet response to political dissent.
We were waiting for our court to take place. We were waiting inside the van, right beside the court. And there I read, I was fired from the institution where I used to work.
With the government promising further crackdowns, Navalny's allies called for a moratorium on street protests until the spring.
If we keep coming out every week, thousands more will be arrested and hundreds beaten.
They're pushing instead for more symbolic acts and rallying international pressure. The U.S. and European allies have both demanded Navalny's release, but also joined in imposing sanctions against high-ranking Russian officials, even if it's with the knowledge, say observers, that the measures change the Kremlin's calculus only so far.
They're not effective, and I'm not sure that there are any kind of sanctions that could influence what happens inside the country. I think the only purpose these sanctions serve is a kind of a signal to Kremlin that what happened is not unnoticed.
Yet Navalny's attacks on government corruption and his growing profile at home and abroad clearly has the Kremlin's attention as well. After years of treating him as politically irrelevant, the Kremlin now prefers the opposition figure out of the picture, whatever the cost. Charles Maines for VOA News, Moscow.
I spoke to Charles Maines for a sense of the political climate in Moscow and whether Navalny's jailing is affecting Vladimir Putin's grip on power. Can you tell me the political climate right now in Moscow and in Russia, if there's a way to describe it?
Well, I think it's clear that you've seen these very significant events over the last half year, starting with the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, his evacuation in a coma to Germany, his resurrection. He recovered and then made this kind of amazing return to Russia. I mean, these are big, big events unfolding. And, on the one hand, we saw, of course, people come out on the streets, but it didn't seem to kind of fundamentally change anything. I think there was an assumption from Navalny and his allies that this would put pressure and really, really transform the political situation here. What we've seen, though, is, of course, with these protests and against Mr. Navalny himself, repression. Fear seems to be the government's main tactic. We saw it in the way that they've sentenced Alexei Navalny to over 2.5 years in prison for these past alleged parole violations, while not investigating his poisoning. And at the same time, we've also seen, over 10,000, 11,000 people arrested over a series of protests in January and February. Just over this past weekend, I was at a pro-democracy forum where municipal candidates were gathering just to talk strategies for the fall elections here in Russia. That was met with police. They stormed the conference and arrested the entire conference. So repression seems to be the main factor here.
Has the jailing of Navalny had any impact on Putin's grip on power?
I think before the sense was that if they gave him a long-term prison sentence, that this would invite protests at home and also a lot of condemnation abroad. But now what we see is a moment where Russia is being condemned for other things already. So the idea of more sanctions on sanctions doesn't have quite as much of a bite. And Navalny himself it's also become very personal between Mr. Putin and Mr. Navalny. He released a video claiming corrupt practices by Mr. Putin, allegedly having this sort of incredible palace in the south of Russia along the Black Sea. There seems to be some truth to it. And although Mr. Putin, I should say, has denied the charges, but a good friend of his claimed to now own the property. But this has suddenly really kind of intruded into Mr. Putin's private circles. And I think that seems to have kind of personalized this conflict between these two men to the point where Putin is out to punish him.
Do you have any sense of what Navalny's followers would like to see the United States do or not do vis-a-vis Navalny?
They've made it quite clear they disagree with the United States for issuing what they call sectoral sanctions, sort of targeting the Russian economy. They see that essentially rallying Russians around Putin or the government per se. And so what they're suggesting is a list of what they call the financiers of Mr. Putin or some of his closest advisors or his friends and his cronies. And they think essentially that's the way to target the Russian government and not target the Russian people. Certainly what they've seen from the Biden administration at this point, they're hoping it's just the beginning. We've seen essentially sanctions against 8 high-ranking Russian government officials, some concerns, some organizations as well that allegedly have ties to chemical weapons development, but not against the financiers, which seems to be a key issue for Navalny's allies.
What do you think is going to happen in the elections in September? Any thought?
If you go back to the poisoning this past August, Mr. Navalny was actually traveling in Siberia trying to rally people around this smart voting campaign that he and his team essentially had come up with. And the idea was to target the unpopularity of the ruling United Russia Party, and that's by pooling votes towards one candidate in particular. So they didn't care who they were, what their views were, but as long as they weren't affiliated with the Kremlin, they would target all the votes this way. And they ran this campaign in 2019 as kind of a test run. And it did have some effectiveness in some races, in some towns, not everywhere, but certainly in Moscow it did, in some towns in Siberia it did. And there was some sense that there's concern there that this could happen again. So it'll be interesting to see if they can keep that momentum going without sort of Mr. Navalny's charisma, use of social media, if people will stay kind of involved in the fight with essentially the leader of it behind bars.
A few days after Navalny's January arrest, his anti-corruption foundation released a video on social media. His foundation claims the video shows a billion-dollar palace built by friends of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has dismissed the claims, and they have not been independently verified. But the video of a lavish palace has generated hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, raising Navalny's profile in Russia. We have a report from our sister network, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
This is an artist's impression of a strip club in a secret palace for the enjoyment of Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to a new YouTube video with tens of millions of views.
This room is also equipped with a large stage and an extraordinary thing. The stage has an elevator with a pole. We can't imagine what a pole on a stage is for.
The video was made by opposition leader Alexei Navalny and posted by his supporters after he was jailed. He claims to have received leaked floor plans of the vast palace, which allegedly includes a casino, a theatre, extensive vineyards, an ice rink and luxury bathrooms, where even the Italian-made toilet brush costs $800. The many allegations in the almost 2-hour video could not be independently verified, and the Kremlin quickly dismissed them. But they are Navalny's latest salvo in an ongoing battle with Putin.
Putin's friends, having received from him the right to steal everything they want in Russia, have repaid him in many ways. But they also chipped in, collected $1.35 billion, and built a palace for their boss.
Navalny was detained on arrival at a Moscow airport on January the 17th, prompting a chorus of international criticism. He had just returned from Berlin, where he was being treated after being poisoned by a Novichok nerve agent in August last year. Investigations by Navalny's team, Bellingcat and other media presented extensive evidence that it was carried out by Russia's Federal Security Service. The Kremlin denies involvement, and pro-government media have been almost silent about all of this. But it appears to have raised Navalny's profile in Russia nonetheless.
The whole story of the poisoning drew the attention of a large number of people, and we have seen that the interest in his return has been pretty high. Of course, we can't say that the whole country has been glued to its screens to follow it, but there is pretty high interest, at least among the digital audience.
This is not the first time that the existence of the palace on the Black Sea coast has been reported. What's new in Navalny's report is the level of detail about the property and how it was allegedly financed with state funds stolen by Putin allies. But Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the video is just a rehash of old claims and noted that it includes an appeal for donations to Navalny's anti-corruption fund.
This is the real scam, and we warn all citizens, especially since the video has so many views. Think before transferring money to such crooks.
Navalny is being held in custody pending a hearing on whether he broke the terms of a suspended sentence relating to a previous conviction for embezzlement. Outside Russia, the conviction was widely seen as part of Kremlin efforts to silence Navalny, but he now faces up to 3.5 years in prison.
The Biden administration has declassified an intelligence report that shows in August of 2020, Russia's FSB intelligence agency plotted the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. Navalny survived the poisoning and identified the plotters. He did so with the help of Christo Grozev, a top researcher with Bellingcat. Bellingcat is an investigative journalism platform specializing in the use of open-source intelligence. I spoke to Grozev about how they tracked down the men who tried to kill Navalny by poisoning him.
We learned a lot of things. The first part of our discovery process led us to a team of poisoners working for the FSB, for a unit called the Criminalistics Institute of the FSB, that actually tailed Navalny for almost 5 years before the poisoning. They were always at his heels whenever he went to a campaign trip around Russia, or even on a vacation trip with his wife. They picked only times that he traveled with an overnight stay over, so they never followed him on day trips, which suggests they might have been interested only in hotel stays as a possible place of poisoning. And we noticed that these were not just regular FSB people, and that was the crucial finding. They were not only political police, as one unit of the FSB is called colloquially. There were some political police people, but on every single trip there was also a team of a chemist and a doctor. A chemist with expertise in chemical weapons, and a doctor also with expertise in treatment of chemical weapons or use of chemical weapons. So this is a picture that got developed in front of our eyes, a team that had traveled with Navalny, alongside Navalny, without him knowing, on more than 35 trips over the last 5 years. And we placed these same people near the location of his hotel in Tomsk. A couple of days earlier, near the location of his hotel in Novosibirsk, where he was initially traveling to. And departing or moving away from the hotel about an hour after he went to bed on the night on which we suspect he was poisoned. So everything pointed to a targeted operation by an FSB clandestine unit. But that was only the first part we discovered. The second part was even more shocking. It was the scale of the operation of this particular unit. It was not an ad hoc operation to poison Navalny. It was an operation that apparently had been targeting many, many other, not only opposition figures in Russia, but also human rights activists, journalists, and in one particular case that we are yet to disclose, an author, a writer, a poet. So the scale of this is still to be determined, but we see that we're talking about definitely more than 10 people that were at the crosshairs of this unit.
How were you able to identify these flights? What was your technique for learning this?
We used a combination of open source and partially closed source data. Over the years, we've accumulated a pretty significant database of, a collection of leaked databases of, for example, outdated travel data. For example, one database includes about 50% of all air travel in Russia from the period 2014-2017. Another database includes leaked passport data and residence data for a number of cities in Russia. So the combination of these to what we call open source sources, because they are in the public domain. You can download them on torrents, and a lot of Russian journalists have done that. Allows us to look for patterns. So, for example, in this particular case, we had identified some people who had traveled with Navalny at every single trip that he took across the country. And that allowed us, through correlation analysis, to pinpoint about 6 people that were suspiciously always traveling with him. Many of them traveled on joint bookings, which allowed us to connect them to one another. That gave us the first hypothesis that there's this team of people who always tail Navalny. Then we had to cross into closed sources data. For that, we had to approach whistleblowers, in some cases, even people who are just selling data on the open market in Russia. There are a lot of data brokers in Russia that traditionally sell data, not to journalists, and they're quite unhappy when they find out they sold it to journalists, but they sell it to companies who do surveillance on their own employees in Russia, or are doing due diligence checks on applicants for jobs. And we got from some of these whistleblowers and or data sources, data brokers, we got phone records, what in Russia they call billing records, which is basically metadata on a particular number, time of call, place of location of the phone, when the call was made. So we were able to get the phone records for these particular 6 people that later expanded to 8 as a total. And we saw that they were communicating with top FSB officials just before the trips with Navalny. And more importantly, they were talking to chemical weapons specialists from exactly the same institute that we had identified in the previous research just before trips with Navalny.
Was there any way to tie it to Putin directly in your research?
Well, I mean, what we saw was them communicating with people at the FSB directorate level. So these are people that would be deputy to Bortnikov. Bortnikov is the chief of the FSB. And we saw this team talking to deputies of Bortnikov. Bortnikov is in direct contact. He directly reports to Putin. The concept of Putin not being aware or having ordered this operation, but let's limit it to not having been aware, is zero. That we've talked to a lot of people that were formerly serving in Russian security services and now live abroad. They've all told us that there's no way that anybody at the FSB would be authorized to go near a chemical weapon without the approval of the FSO, the president's own personal security service, simply for the fact that this is too dangerous, because somebody who gets access to such a high-grade poison might just go crazy and start attacking even the president. So the president needs to be in the know anytime somebody at any security service uses chemical weapons.
Were you able to speak or interview Mr. Navalny? And he also himself was part of discovering who it was who had poisoned him. Is that right?
Well, not him himself. We tried to firewall him from the discovery process, but we invited members of his own investigation team, the people that do anti-corruption investigations in Russia. And one of the key investigators, Maria Pevchik, she joined us at the last stage of our investigation. We made sure that Alexei Navalny is only informed at the last moment. So basically a week before we published, we brought him into the picture, just because we didn't want his own perception to bias our investigation. But yes, we brought him in at the last moment. We did have to get data from him through his chief investigator about his own travel. So that's what he was sharing with us, but without really knowing until late in the process who exactly were his would-be poisoners.
Your investigative journalism is just incredible, but you're dealing with very serious topics. Do you have any fear for your life?
Obviously, and especially after we found out for ourselves that this FSB unit had been after Navalny, while Navalny was at the crosshairs of the propaganda campaign of the Kremlin. We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing, because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both, and they've been the Russian government has been so vocal about accusing Bellingcat and me and my colleagues of being a mouthpiece of Western intelligence and of being spies and of being traitors and what have you, that we have to start getting concerned.
Due to the poisoning of Navalny, the U.S. government announced economic sanctions. The sanctions are directed against several top Russian officials. The U.S. also reiterated demands that the opposition leader be released. But no sanctions were specifically directed at President Vladimir Putin or his inner circle. VOA White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara tells us more.
This penal colony about 100 kilometers east of Moscow is where outspoken Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny has been jailed since last month after surviving a poison attack last year. The Biden administration declassified intelligence showing that Moscow orchestrated the poisoning and announced sanctions on 14 Russian entities and 7 senior members of the Russian government.
Expansion of sanctions under the Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Warfare Elimination Act, new export restrictions on items that could be used for biological agent and chemical production, and visa restrictions.
Press Secretary Jen Psaki repeated U.S. demands for Navalny's release. The opposition leader's arrest set off nationwide street protests in Russia last month. Navalny contends his jailing is politically motivated. The U.S. sanctions were coordinated with European partners and Britain, but not specifically directed at President Vladimir Putin or the oligarchs of his inner circle.
Russia is a huge country. It has a lot of ways to influence the events in many parts of the world. So I understand that the only thing that Biden's administration could do is to send signals. These are strong signals, but these are just signals. This is not something that has a material effect.
The White House denies the sanctions are largely symbolic. Responding to VOA, Psaki acknowledged it is important to maintain relations with Moscow on many issues, including on the Iran nuclear negotiation.
Russia is a P5+1 partner. They were as we pursued the JCPOA under the Obama-Biden administration, and they certainly would be a key partner if that diplomatic process were to move forward. So the point is, there are areas where we disagree. There are areas where there's significant challenge. There are also areas where we are going to work with the Russians, as we would with most global partners, when we need to take steps that are in the interest of the United States.
Last month, President Joe Biden said that unlike his predecessor, he has made clear to Putin that the U.S. will no longer tolerate Russian aggressive actions, including election interference, cyber attacks, and the poisoning of its citizens. But analysts say Biden's policy toward Russia must allow room for engagement in areas of mutual interest.
This includes arms control, a positive environmental and economic agenda in the Arctic, to some extent climate change, and a couple of regional theaters where we both have troops, including in Syria. So there's a need to work with Russia on a range of issues, and I think the Biden administration will pursue both cooperation and try to reestablish clear lines of what they regard as appropriate norms of international behavior.
Meanwhile, Moscow has already vowed to retaliate against the sanctions. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
From economic sanctions to retaliation over Russia's recent suspected hacking of several U.S. government agencies, the international community is closely watching the Biden administration's next steps regarding U.S.-Russia policy. Matthew Rojansky is the director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He is a leading analyst on U.S.-Russia relations, and I asked him where that relationship is headed next.
Well, look, this is a challenged relationship. From the U.S. perspective, we've seen a tremendous amount of troubling behavior from the Russian side. I think most salient for most people is interfering in U.S. elections. You know, a constant barrage of social media propaganda, other forms of interference, attempts to sort of exploit divisions that already